Hi, everybody, and welcome to, I think it's the 51st Trasna de Tira lecture this evening, which is brilliant. Coming up next week, we have two fantastic lectures, very diverse. We have Common and Mon and the Military Service Pensions Collection from Alvy New Rourke on Monday. And on Tuesday, we're going to have a fascinating lecture, which is A Forgotten Order, the Orange Order in Ireland. So Quincy Dugan covers the history of the Orange Order, and although we now associate it with Northern Ireland, it was obviously in the past associated with all counties in Ireland, and Quincy's going to cover that. So just a little bit of an update. So for July and August, we're going to reduce the frequency of lectures to one night per week, every Wednesday. And we will ramp that back up again in September and October. But we know people are going on holidays and stuff like that, so we just won't get the audience we need to get to. So this evening, delighted to be joined here by Clare Busher-O'Sullivan, originally from Wexford. She moved all the way to Cork to complete her BA in History and Archaeology at UCC. She studied Irish rock art at postgraduate level, resulting in completion of a thesis, a conservation study of prehistoric rock art in the southwest of Ireland, and she did that from 2015 to 2018. She has experience in many different aspects of archaeology, excavation, both in Ireland and abroad, involved in cataloguing and assisting with exhibits in Cork Public Museum in 2014 to 2017. She has presented and published research on Irish rock art, both nationally and internationally, and she's got a number of forthcoming publications this year. So without further ado, Clare, your fault you wrote, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Liam. It's great to be here, and thank you everyone for tuning in. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about my research topic. So I looked at the conservation of prehistoric rock art in Southwest Ireland. So my study area was Cork and Kerry, namely the Iveragh Peninsula and the Mizen Peninsula. And my aims and objectives were to assess the state of conservation of these monument type, the prehistoric rock art, in terms of weathering and erosion, and in terms of, any kind of negative impacts like human interaction, animal impacts, and how these affected the rock art panels. So just to start off, what is prehistoric open air rock art? So North Atlantic rock art is identified by its distribution in along the North Atlantic coastline. So Atlantic art was a term coined by Mark White in the 1940s to compare the kind of in a comparison of the rock art that he saw in Galicia and in Ireland, and then similar parallels in the UK. And there's, high concentrations in Iberia and southwest Spain, and in Galicia, in northern England, in Scotland, in Ireland, and in parts of Brittany and France. So the art is characterized by cup and ring motifs, and most of the motifs associated with this tradition are variations on the cup and ring motif. And the art is comprised of the abstract geometric motifs. So, you have a cup mark surrounded by rings and radial grooves, amongst other motifs, and they form variations of designs on the surface and boulders of outcrops. And the carvings often exploit natural grooves and joints on the rock surface. In Galicia, the abstract motifs are found alongside figurative carvings of animals and weaponry, but they do not draw parallels in Ireland, as there is no figurative carvings in our North Atlantic tradition. So North Atlantic rock art, it's important to note that it is a separate tradition than the megalithic art that we'd associate with the passage grave cemeteries of Newgrange and Loughcrew. Although there may be parallels between the motifs used, with the cup mark and a number of other motifs, they are very separate traditions. Here's just an example of some Scottish rock art, some Northern English rock art, and some Irish rock art from Leather West in County Kerry. And as you can see, there's quite strong parallels. This is kind of a good example of what you'd be looking to find in a North Atlantic rock art context. So here are just some more examples of rock art that I've looked at during my time studying in the region. And you have elaborate panels, and then you have less elaborate panels. For example, you have the one here in the top right corner, and two cut marks with surrounding rings from Durini, next to Derry Blaha on the Iveragh Peninsula. And then you have more elaborate carvings at Leather West, at Keele Duff, and at Derry Blaha itself. And then you have a rosette motif here from West Cork. So the meaning and significance of rock art. So this is a question that always comes up. Everyone's always interested to know what the meaning and significance of the art is. And our problem here really is we have very little direct context for the rock art. So it's very difficult to explain a definite it's very hard to give a definite explanation of its significance. But many archaeologists and researchers have theorized on this over the years. People have suggested it marks boundaries and routeways within prehistoric landscapes, with certain elaborate panels maybe casting view sheds over important topographical features. Rock art may be mark places of worships on pilgrimage on the periphery or within prehistoric society. And as well as that, especially in the Southwest, I've noticed the distribution of rock art on water source, on the tributaries and along water sources, kind of prompted some researchers to suggest an association with the cult on water sources. So then carrying on from that, the rock art in Leather West and Keele Duff Upper and Cúma Saharn, three townlands I'll talk about in depth in a moment, and the rock art in Derry Blaha and Durini, which are two neighbouring townlands which are very well known on the southeastern section of the Iveragh Peninsula. And you can see here the distribution of the rock art along the tributaries of Lough Bryn in Derry Blaha and Durini, and in near the Cúma Glaslaw and Cúma Saharn Lake in the Leather West Valley. So again, similar trends have been found in the Lochadoon Valley in the Dingle Peninsula and on the Mizen Peninsula in County Cork. So although there is, I did focus a little bit on the Mizen Peninsula during my research, but obviously the clusters of rock art, the main cluster of rock art is in the Cork and Kerry region. So although there are clusters elsewhere, like, there's high concentrations in Fermanagh and Donegal and Wicklow and Carlow, the highest concentration is on the Iveragh Peninsula. There are some examples on the Mizen Peninsula, but there are much fewer. So as I was saying, the main concentrations in Ireland, and although there are accounts for some early recorded examples, many have been, there are examples of ones that have been destroyed or that cannot be accounted for as a result of a field clearance. So yeah, this is my study area. So you can see here the Dingle Peninsula, the Iveragh Peninsula, and the Mizen Peninsula. So you can see here these two arrows. So on the southeast, there are the townlands of Derry Blaha and Durini, which I'll be discussing. And then on the northwest, there is the three townlands, neighbouring townlands again, Cúma Saharn, Keele Duff Upper, and Leather West. So this is just a bit of background to the region. This is the bedrock geology of the southwest of Ireland. So you can see here the majority of the boulders and outcrops where that have rock art are Devonian sandstone. And sandstone is formed from detrital material bonded together with calcium carbonate and silica. So these are they're not like weak rocks, but compared to other forms of rocks, they would be much more susceptible to weathering processes. So then the soil in this region, the majority of the soil in the landscapes that I have studied is peaty podzels and bogs, so non-arable land, mostly peat and bog. So yeah, the townlands of Leather West, Cúma Saharn and Keele Duff Upper, you can see here. And then here are the lakes in which the rock art is located near. Carhill Hillon then, as well as the topographical features like, the valleys, the mountains, the lakes, there are also an archaeological landscape that we have to consider for a better context for archaeological monuments. So in Carhill Hillon, It's kind of well known for its early medieval monuments, and also has a good few examples of rock art. So just to set the scene a little bit further, here is Keelduff Upper in the Iveragh Peninsula. So this is the kind of landscapes that you're looking at, where much of this rock art is situated. Here's a landscape shot from Letter West. Letter West again, and not too far from the Coomaglaslaw Lake. You can see that there in the background. And then here's the remains of a hut site from Keelduff Upper again. So as you can imagine, trying to find one piece of rock art in that field is quite challenging on occasion. And then here is Loch na Parka. So that's between Keelduff Upper going towards Cooma Saharan. And then just a picture of the routeway through Letter West. So really briefly then, just to kind of put the rock art in context, I'll just give a little brief history of, our first recordings and, how rock art was, interpreted at the beginning. So rock art in England and Ireland really began to be noticed and recorded in the late 19th century. And then since then, several research approaches have been identified. In terms of prehistoric open air art, the research approaches are mostly landscape due to the lack of context, the lack of direct, ethnographic or any other evidence that we have with the rock art. And then, so the main approach really is the landscape approach, one of the main approaches. And then, so in 1860, Charles Graves presented a paper on a previously undescribed class of monument. So that was rock art, the first recording of rock art we have, and he accompanied it with this image from Stag Bridge. So this is an example of a heel ball rubbing from Stag Bridge. And then following in his footsteps, George Coffey and PJ Lynch recorded other rocks from this region. This panel here that you can see in the background is Gert na Gullah, which was recorded by PJ Lynch, who also recorded another panel at Cathaoirleach. So this panel is particularly interesting. As you can see here, these two rocks, one was recorded in 1906 and the other in 1939. Although there is only about 30 years between them, you can see on the southeast section of the picture on the right, it looks to be, looks to be a lot more damage. And apparently McAllister, who also recorded this rock, he said that was as a result of a fire being lit on the surface of the rock, which happened when a certain bishop came to visit the site. And despite my best efforts trying to locate that panel, I think its last known whereabouts was in a farmyard somewhere near Cathaoirleach, but I have not had any luck as yet. So the importance of these early antiquarian accounts. So in some cases, they provide the only account of panels that are now missing and destroyed. So for example, this panel here at Gert Boy, and you can see it in the top left-hand picture of the other image. And that panel is no longer in situ and cannot be located. And this happens a bit with prehistoric rock art. There's several accounts of rock art being blown up with dynamite, rock art being broken up and thrown in ditches, and for land clearing and for agricultural purposes. Another really important thing about the early antiquarian accounts is that it allows us to compare and assess the effects of weathering and erosion from the early accounts to the state of preservation that the panel is now in. So in moving on to the mid-20th century, and it was Owen MacWhite who first distinguished between megalithic rock art and open-air rock art. So he divided them into the categories and referred to the open-air carvings as the Galician cup and ring carvings. And as you can see here, he provided a diagram of some of the motifs that he associated with the Galician rock art. So then moving on to the 1960s and the townland of Derry na Blaha, which you can see here indicated by the green arrow, received some international attention. When an Italian archaeologist, Emanuele Nati, visited the site in 1960, so he recorded 15 panels, and he theorized greatly on a number of the panels. For example, he suggested that there was possibly an anthropomorphic carving in the top left-hand image that you can see here, which was later, dismissed as a result of we had no evidence for any figurative carvings in the Irish rock art repertoire. And also the other panel here that you can see, he suggested that it could be a shield. It's on his rock 10A as he recorded it, and he said, you know, that there was a notch that could represent, you know, could be interpreted as a shield. However, later on then in 1965, that drew attention from John Coles, who suggested that, you know, that shield image drew parallel with a later Bronze Age artifacts on the continent. And despite that theory, in 1968, she and O'Kelly researched at the site, looked at it and traced it, and basically dismissed that theory also, as the V notch did not, or the U notch did not exist. So basically they drew parallels between, if you can see the bottom image there, between that image and Ponte Verde in Galicia. So it is consistent with the North Atlantic imagery. So here is just a brief summary of some of the people who have researched this region. So researching the Southwest, she wrote a very important paper that I referenced throughout my research in 1968 on a number of stones from County Cork. Finlay then produced the first ever catalogue of rock art from the region in 1973, cataloguing over 50 townlands, which was a fantastic resource. Purcell in 1994 took a landscape approach to the Évora Peninsula, and then following on from that, O'Sullivan and Sheehan in 1996 did a survey, the Évora survey. Carol Martin and Patricia Long in 2000 and 2002, master's theses, several national monument surveys. Joanna Valdez-Tuley in 2009 put it in a wider European context, and Caitlin O'Neill then did similar in 2009 also. So outside of Southwest Ireland, what's happening with rock art? So as you can see here on the left, there's a very interesting image of a rock art panel forming part of a field wall in County Carlow. And this panel actually has quite an interesting story. It was found by the landowner in 4 different pieces in the ditch. So himself and I think it was Chris Corlett from the National Monument Service put it back together, and now it's accessible to be seen by anyone who's passing that way. I think one of the most important breakthroughs in rock art research, undoubtedly, is the excavation, the only excavation so far of a rock art site in Ireland by Blaise O'Connor as part of her PhD in 2003 with UCD. So that excavation basically discovered flint scraper, glass beads, and stone-lined pits and various other archaeological evidence to put the rock art at Drummeril in County Monaghan into a further context. So now that we've kind of established the history, a little bit of the history of rock art, a little bit of the background, the characteristics. Now I'm going to look at the conservation aspect. So as you can see from some of these images, there's a lot of moss and lichen and a bog covering, and different forms of natural flora and microflora. So basically there's two main areas that cause threat to Irish rock art, and they are human agency and natural agency, so natural weathering and erosion. So basically the principal agent for rock art weathering is rainwater. So rainwater from precipitation, which lodges in the rock surface, because it mechanically erodes and chemically dissolves the stone surface. And as the rainwater falls, it mixes with different nitrates and sulfides in the air, which causes weak acids. It may not be classed as acid rain, but it is still acidic rain. Water often lodges in the pores and cracks on the rock surface, often in hygroscopic form where the films develop on the rock surface, often causing chemical reactions with the bedrock and in turn forming mineral reactions. And as you can see here, the two images on this slide, they're very flat-lying, low-lying panels, so they are much more at risk of collecting rainwater than maybe a hog-backed panel would be. And as you can see, the top image, the more northern section there in the image, you can see it's much more harshly weathered, and that's because the southern section that we're looking at to the south at the moment was completely covered in bog and protected from rainwater and the elements. Yeah, the most common weathering process results from the presence of rainwater is dissolution. This process refers to the continuous removal of soluble material from the rock surface. So wind causes mechanical abrasion by carrying sand, dust and grit, and the destructive processes then is increased when the presence of salt or moisture. So another major aspect of weathering and erosion in terms of like rainwater is freeze-thaw action, and I saw this all too frequently on the panels in the study area. So the visible effects of the presence of erosion is evident in the form of freeze-thaw action. So many of the panels in the study area, I brought a geologist with me one day in the field, and he was telling me that we picked out a few examples, and he was looking at the panel surface, and a lot of the rainwater would fall and lodge in the natural joints and cracks on the rock surface, and therefore when the temperatures drop below zero, the water would freeze, and that would eventually cause the joints and fissures to expand. So this would, if this happened over time, which you're talking 5,000 years, so I'd say it happened a lot, then it would eventually cause the surface to weaken, and it would cause those joints to fracture. So that's kind of, then if you had, say for example, if the panel was then in a field with hoofed animals or, with human contact, it would be much more susceptible to mechanical damage because it has been weakened by these rainwater processes. So another aspect of natural weathering that was really evident in Leather West and in Keelduff was the presence of bog and blanket peat. And as you can see in the top two images, the bog and blanket peat are intruding on the rock surface. So bog, despite the fact that the peat does release some acids that do cause some minor mechanical or minor erosion to the rock surfaces, but despite this, it does protect the panels from the other elements like rainwater and such. But it does cause the rock surface to lose its color. As you can see, maybe just around the bog covering, there's a much lighter color visible. That's from the blanket peat basically covering the surface and causing something called leaching, which is removing the mineral from the rock. And then in the lower left-hand corner, you can see there's some cup and rings there, but there's some moss and some other microflora growing within them. And then on the far side, then we have you can see kind of a rust shade on top of the rock. And basically what that is the carbonic acid within the rainwater extracts the iron oxide in the rocks formation. So that then causes this mineral reaction that causes that darker rust color. So apart from the microflora and the bog covering and those microfloras and vegetation, another aspect that you have to consider when searching for rock art panels is overgrowth of vegetation. So you can see here, indicated by the red arrow, in that bush there, or very near there, is a cruciform motif you can see here on a panel, and you can see the earlier recording by Purcell. So that's quite hard to access at the moment, and basically it took quite a while to find. So moving on then again to look at the more kind of maybe more in-depth weathering processes and weathering effects. So this panel here is from Ballynahoubeg. Now the panel at Ballynahoubeg is an isolated example in the townland of Ballynahoubeg, which is different from the previous examples that we've looked at, that occur in clusters in open valleys and in the landscape. This one is in a field on its own, and it's hog-backed, and you can see here there's mosses and lichens and various other microflora growing within the rock carvings. So basically this panel is quite harshly weathered, because if you see here, this is a recording by Finola Finlay in 1973. And you can see the right-hand side, there's a cup and two rings connected to a cup, and partial ring and surrounding ring, and a radial groove. or curved line. So basically, this is my photograph of it from 2015, and there is hardly a trace of the original carving left. And if we look further at it, you can see here, it's very, very harshly weathered. And here is an up close image from 2015 as well, compared with Averell Purcell's 1994 image of the rock. So the weathering was very, very harsh on the surface of this panel. So again, here, this is a panel from Tullakeel, which was recorded another one of Graves's contributions in 1864. And here it is in 2015, and you can see it's completely covered in moss and lichen. And speaking of lichen, I did carry out some case studies with a lichenologist during my research. And we looked at this panel in particular. This was the main case study for this particular project. And as you can see from this photo, there's lichen. You can see a lot of different colored lichen with, you know, much higher concentration to the north of the rock. So this panel is actually 100% covered in lichen. So the lichenologist said this is 100% covered in lichen, and this is it to the naked eye. So obviously light and lighting plays a massive part in seeing rock art motifs. And this rock, this particular rock, is very, very, very densely covered with a massive array of different motifs. And it's very elaborate, but on a normal, dreary, rainy day, it's very hard to see the carvings with the lichen covering. You can kind of make them out there, but the lighting does have to be right. We've actually identified 7 different species of lichen on the surface of that rock. And I was chatting to the lichenologist, and he basically said that although the rock is 100% covered in lichen, and they may be, you know, the lichens may contribute slightly to the, you know, to the decay of the rock. If we were to remove the lichens, like they have done in Scandinavia and in parts of Europe, it would leave the rock surface much more susceptible and much more fragile and more susceptible to harsher lichens. And what I mean by that is, now the lichens on this rock, according to the lichenologist Paul Whelan, basically they have been grown for between 500 and 600 years, and they're very slow growing. Whereas if we were to remove them, they'd be replaced with much more aggressive and damaging lichens as a result of, you know, the chemicals from pesticides and fertilizers that would be in the atmosphere. So instead of obviously removing the lichens, which is not a possibility at all, and I don't think it should happen, I made a photogrammetry. I carried out some photogrammetry and some laser scanning on the site in like an attempt to hopefully bring some of the carvings, you know, to kind of understand some of the carvings better and to maybe see them better visibly. So I'm sure some people are familiar with the process of photogrammetry and the AggiSoft software. And so what I did was I made the mesh model, and then I applied a filter, and then you can basically move the model around and manipulate it to whatever angle you want to maybe draw attention to and to look at further. I also carried out a laser scan of the site, and this model was the result. And as you can see, the laser scan brings up the rock art much clearer than the photogrammetry model. But either way, they're both much clearer than the images that I took. So again, you can manipulate the model to whatever angle you want to draw attention to whatever section of the panel that you want to look at. So following on from that, I also carried out some laser scanning at a site in Clare, near Kilmurray in County Cork. And this panel here, this is a rubbing of it by She in 1968. And obviously the surface there looks so elaborate, and the carvings are, you know, very well executed, and it's, you know, it looks like such an elaborate piece of rock art. So I visited there in 2017, and that's what the surface looks like now. And although you can distinguish a number of motifs, the actual extent of the once recorded panel is not visible. So what we did was we carried out some laser scanning and made a 3D model of the rock, which looks like this. So you can see again all the original recorded motifs by She. You can see them quite clearly there. And again, as with photogrammetry and laser scanning, you can add different filters to the surface of the rock to maybe highlight certain areas that you'd like to see more clearly. And there's just another filter. So the importance of modern recording technology to archaeology, it's so many different rock art organizations and different archaeological groups use these modern technologies as a form of recording, as they are non-invasive and they're relatively inexpensive. So for example, the Scottish Rock Art Project, they regularly use it to record the rock art and to make the information available online to enthusiasts and researchers. And the same with the Discovery Programme in Ireland, they use it, and Sketchfab and other website hosts like that are such fantastic sources for people to publish their laser scans and to publish their models. So it disseminates the information, and it keeps a preservation by record of certain sites. So although there's very little that we can do to deter the weathering processes that I just discussed, there is something that we can do about the human interaction with rock art, so the negative human impact. So globally, there are several traditions of rock art ranging in style and chronology. I'm sure people have heard of Paleolithic art and things like that. That's a separate tradition, but basically some of these sites are listed on the World Heritage List, and therefore they're covered by UNESCO legislation. So for example, in Ireland we have Skellig Michael, and we have the Boyne Valley. They're UNESCO protected sites, and in Australia and in mainland Europe there are rock art Paleolithic sites, etc., that are on the World Heritage List. And several of these rock art rich countries have developed rock art specific legislation and guidelines. For example, South Africa and Australia have guidelines relating exactly to specifically to rock art in certain regions and different types of rock art. So rock art in Ireland is considered a national monument and therefore protected by the National Monuments Act. And alongside that, there are guidelines for the protection of archaeological monuments from farming, forestry and development. Basically that, you can't plant or develop within 20 meters of a listed archaeological site. Despite this, there are a lot of, there is rock art often occurring on, farming and land use for farming and agriculture. And this image here on the left, I'm sure everyone's probably familiar with this fantastic image by Ken Williams. It basically shows the location of some rock art in agricultural and farming landscapes. And as you can imagine, maybe a rock like this that had incurred the weathering processes and is now, very vulnerable to fracturing. If it was in a field with some hoofed animals, it would definitely cause some more damage. And this panel here at Knocknageehee in County Cork, it's a cut mark stone, and it's in the centre of a ploughed field. And then we have this panel here. This is actually a cut mark standing stone at Burgatia in County Cork, very close to Rosscarbery. And this is actually opposite somebody's front door. So despite the fact that the majority of the rock art is in a rural landscape setting, some, are quite close, quite close to human interaction, often do experience negative, human impact or, human interference. And then again, there's just more evidence of, hoofed animals walking on the surfaces of the panels. So then we move to development. And here's an image from Leather West from 2019, not too long ago now. And this is a waterworks being built literally very, very, very close, just meters away from some decorated panels. So although there is legislation in place to stop this happening, does it really have any impact when things like this are, still going ahead? And this was, this is quite a significant landscape for rock art discoveries. And as you heard from Eve the other week, she's finding fantastic examples of rock art in the region. And something like this is really obstructing the view sheds and the region, the rock art landscape essentially. And alongside that human interference, we also have, I don't want to call this vandalism, but it's a negative human influence on the rock surface basically in the top left corner there, you have peat bog has been moved off of the carvings. And although I know people are, you know, mad to see what's under there, is there any rock art under here, or is there any more? It's not the thing to do. As you know, as I was saying earlier, that the bog produces acids that often you know, interact and cause chemical reaction with the rock surface. So sometimes if the rock is weak and fractured and you pull off the bog, some of the rock will come to, and it will just cause the rock will be you know, exposed and much more susceptible to further damage and decay. And the other two images, you can see that somebody with some kind of chalk or paint filled out the carvings to kind of maybe make them more visible to the naked eye. But you know, this is not the thing to do either. This is you know, you're not supposed to interfere with any of these monument types. This is why we have photogrammetry and laser scanning, so that we can actually, you know, I presume whoever did this wanted to see the carvings more clearly, as we all do, but laser scanning and photogrammetry is the way to go, rather than, you know, coloring them in. So then how do we physically protect prehistoric monuments? So I had during my research in this region, I found some sites were cordoned off. For example, this site here in West Cork, in Knocknageehee, there is a stone circle, a cut marked stone, and a boulder burial within this little enclosure here. You can see the fence that the farmer has constructed. So in this field, you know, cows are regularly here, but they cannot interfere with the prehistoric monuments because of the fence. So this is fantastic, but I can understand how it's not feasible for every single piece of rock art. And that's just an example of how to physically protect the panels. What are the possibilities? Well, I did think about this. I also thought about up in the west of Ireland, there's high crosses in glass cases, you know, to protect from the elements. But I think that would be, you know, that would be quite an expensive thing to invest in for rock art, as we have over 700 pieces in the country. This panel here, this is an ohm stone from County Cork, and as you can see, there's a cattle grid around the site to prevent animal interference. However, I don't think that's massively feasible for open air rock art either, as there is just too many pieces, and it wouldn't really work. So apart from the open air rock art that's you know, in situ in the field, you know, in these gorgeous open air valleys, which are fantastic to go and visit, especially on a nice sunny day. You don't have to get mucked up to the eyeballs to view rock art. There are some panels that are on display in the stone corridor in UCC. So the Mohill stone, for example, is the only known example of rock art from County Waterford. Is alongside the Gert Brack stone from County Cork, and they're both on display in the Cork Public Museum, or the UCC stone corridor. And then on the bottom there's the Yall stone, and that is on display in the National Museum of Ireland. So similar panels are on display in different parts of the UK. There's a decorated boulder on the grounds of Yorkshire Museum, and then you know, a further cyst cover on display in the Fulham Museum in Durham. And Northumberland and Durham in the north of England has a very high concentration of rock art, and I visited there not too long ago, and they have a really good system in Ilkley Moor. They have rock art rangers who bring groups to see the rock art, and therefore, you know, there's no possibility of negative human interaction if, you know, there's a supervisor and there's somebody showing people around, which I think is fantastic. So I think probably the best way to go about preserving rock art is, obviously preservation by record is essential. I know, not like, you know, it would be fantastic if we could preserve the rock art perfectly in the field, but, you know, with accelerated climate change and weathering, as you can see from the images like previously, it's just impossible. So the way forward, I think, is definitely preservation by record and promoting public awareness. So in 2015, I just started my postgraduate research on rock art conservation in Southwest Ireland, and I was based in Cork Public Museum. And I remember talking to my boss, and he said we were looking for an exhibition for the upstairs exhibition room. So I thought, what better time to have a rock art exhibition? So we got a team together, Finola Finlay, who did a great talk on tower houses last week, and we got Ken Williams, who's fantastic with photography, and Keith Payne. So a group got together and created this rock art exhibition, as you can see here. And a feature of our exhibition was the Blewett Stone, which was housed in the Cork Book Museum at the time. So this drew a lot of attention and did promote awareness. I'm still hearing about it. People were very impressed with it. So that was that. What other rock art projects are there? Well, in the UK, some of my colleagues in the UK have developed and are working on different rock art projects. For example, the Northumberland Durham Rock Art Project basically led to the development of the Rock Art Mobile Project, which basically provided training and education to local communities to use mobile phones and a rock art app on the mobile phone to record rock art in the region, which I think is a fantastic idea. The Scotland's Rock Art Project has really taken off in the last year, so it's fantastic. The images online are just brilliant. And closer to home then, we have the Wicklow Rock Art Project, which Cliona Ní Lennon was basically did as part of her PhD in UCD, along with some fabulous images there from Ken Williams again. So what next? Now that we have now that we have all these fantastic examples of rock art, and with the receding blanket peat and blanket bog, there are more coming to light all the time. So it's more important than ever to raise awareness and to record the panels. So as I said, preservation by record the panels. It is absolutely paramount to report new finds to the National Monument Service. So you can get those details on archaeology.ie. And to keep up to date, basically, I run some rock art pages myself. I have the Ireland's Prehistoric Rock Art on Twitter and on Instagram. And recently in the last year, I developed a website, so Ireland's Prehistoric Rock Art, just to provide some further information on the conservation aspect and of my own research and the rock art that I have analysed. So thank you for listening, and that kind of sums it up.
Thanks a million, Claire. That was a fascinating lecture, thoroughly enjoyable. And I've got a couple of questions here for you, if you wouldn't mind fielding them.
Yeah, of course.
It's a great sign of a lecture when the numbers start going up as the lecture goes on, because obviously the word is getting out that this is a really good topic, and that was certainly the case in this lecture. How did you get involved in this field yourself?
Well, to be honest, when I was doing my BA, at the end of the BA, you have to pick something that you're going to write a short dissertation on, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 words. And I was looking through, what for archaeology, what could I possibly do my project on? And I just absolutely, like, the rock art kind of jumped at me. I kind of went into kind of looking at megalithic rock art, and then on further research, I realized there was another tradition of rock art that was, to me, even more appealing. So that's how I kind of got into it. And then, Billy O'Brien, my supervisor, then kind of, spurred me on, and then I kind of just got stuck in.
And now there's probably no escape. It's going to be kind of a lifetime passion, I can imagine.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely a passion. I really enjoy it now. There's no getting away from it.
Brilliant. I've another one in there in terms of the high concentration, and I'll make no apologies for this. This is from me. I wrote it down at the start because I'm from Kerry myself, the Iveragh Peninsula. What, in your opinion, is the reason for the high concentration of rock art in the Iveragh Peninsula?
Do you know, I'm not actually, that's a tricky one, Liam. I'm not actually sure. I know that it could be partially, there could have been a lot more rock art in other places elsewhere, but maybe on more arable land that was then subject to land clearing, and that's why there's not high concentrations. But I couldn't be sure on that one.
And you've just answered my next question as well. And I'm particularly thinking of this in terms of, so I'm from Iveragh Peninsula myself. My mum is from Achill in Mayo, and probably similar levels, I suppose, of arableness of the land. And I'm aware of so much rock art down in Kerry, and not so much up, and maybe this is just me, up around the Achill area and stuff like that. Do you think it's due to kind of local population, or it's due to the kind of the kind of agricultural practices later? What's your opinion on that front?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure on that one. I know there is a fantastic example of rock art in Mayo, the Bohay stone. It's just there beside Croagh Patrick. It's really elaborate. But in terms of the high concentration in Kerry, I'm not 100% sure on that one.
Well, brilliant. Thanks so much, Claire. And unless anyone,
thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it, and thanks everyone.
I've got one final question, and I've a soft spot for Donegal as well. And there's one question in there: any example of rock art in Donegal?
Yeah, there is. I think there is a Facebook page dedicated to rock art in Donegal, or near Donegal. I'm not 100% sure, but I could take an email and let whoever know, or I'm you know, if you look up on the archaeology.ie, either the website, the historic environment viewer, and you type in rock art and fill out your the little section where to say what you're looking for, and you should be able to spot the rock art there. If you type it in, the dots will come up where the rock art is. So that might help.
Brilliant, Claire, and thanks so much. All the comments coming in are extremely complimentary. I'm not going to go through them all. Rock art is an absolutely fascinating subject, and you've done a brilliant lecture tonight, and thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, William.
And hopefully we'll have you back again to talk about something else in the future.
That'd be great. Thanks a million, Liam.
Thanks. Okay, slán go fóill.
Slán go fóill.